Chapter 1. Tuscumbia. Helen Keller was born in June of 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a small, sleepy, very southern town. In her own words, the beginning of my life was simple and much like every other little life. I came, I saw, I conquered, as the first baby in the family always does. But at the age of 19 months she came down with a raging fever and what was called acute congestion of the stomach and brain. And after that, no part of her life would ever be simple again. The doctor had said she might not recover, yet early one morning the fever left as suddenly as it came. She fell into a peaceful sleep. Waking from time to time she saw light and dark, with the light growing dimmer day by day, until there was only dark. Her mother, Kate, was giving Helen a bath when she happened to pass a hand in front of the baby's eyes, and it seemed to her that the eyes never blinked. She did it again, and again there was no response, no movement of the eyelids. No matter how many times she tried, it was always the same. She understood that her little girl was blind. They took her by train to a doctor in Union City, Tennessee, a long journey, during which Helen shrieked without stopping. When they got there, the doctor said there was nothing to be done for her eyes. Soon her parents learned the child was deaf as well. One evening, when the bell was rung for dinner, they noticed that she had made no move to go, so they rattled a tin can filled with stones that had once been one of her favorite toys. She never turned her head. They spoke to her gently, they yelled, but nothing changed. She had learned to speak quite early, using a handful of words that strangers might not have recognized as words, but when she stopped hearing human speech, she stopped trying to speak, although not all at once. It happened slowly over time. The last word she remembered was water, and she went on making some sound for it after all other words were gone. Once her strength returned, Helen was as healthy, alert, and energetic as she used to be. She had no way of knowing that the rest of the family saw and heard and spoke, or that she was in any way different from them, and she began doing what every child does. She explored her world, poking her fingers into anything they met, touching, tasting, sniffing, pinching. By following with her hands the movements and operations of other hands, she learned what those other hands were up to and began to imitate them. The family that surrounded her tried to carry on with ordinary life as if this enormous tragedy had never fallen on them. What else could they do? It was a sizable family. The father, Arthur Keller, had been a captain in the Confederate Army. Helen's cousin Layla described him as a splendid man, large and fine-looking, and a genuine Christian. 20 years older than Kate, a widower when they married, he had 2 sons. James, who was about the same age as Kate, and William, a teenager the family called by his middle name, Simpson. The sons addressed their father as captain, and so did everyone else. He was the editor and publisher of a weekly newspaper. Like many upper-middle-class Southerners in the years after the Civil War, he owned parcels of land here and there, as well as the family home. But he was always short of money. He was a devoted father, although often a wrong-headed one. Kate Adams Keller, the captain's young second wife, had a large Southern household to run, which meant curing hams, putting up jellies and preserves, looking after the poultry, the vegetable garden, the old-fashioned flower garden, and supervising the black servants who lived in the same shacks they had occupied 15 years earlier when they were slaves. Kate worked alongside them from early morning until after dinner. She was reserved in nature, thoughtful and inward-looking, and a great reader. So there were the father and mother, the 2 big sons, the little girl who was locked inside her own body, and Evelyn Keller, the captain's older sister, known as Aunt Ev. Their home was about a mile out of town. In addition to the main house, Ivy Green, there were barns, stables, chicken coops, outhouses, a smokehouse, the servants' shacks, and a garden cottage. None of it was grand. Even in Ivy Green, none of the rooms was large or generous. It was a working farm in a rural backwater. If there was a single school for the blind anywhere in Alabama, Kate had never heard of it. She went about her daily tasks and thought her private thoughts, with Helen going everywhere her mother went, clutching her skirts. Before the illness had been a much-loved and loving child, and she still was. Her playmates had been Martha Washington, the cook's little daughter, and Belle, an old hunting dog, and they were her playmates now. She bullied them just as she used to, and in her own way she was still talkative. She had learned to talk with signs. By the time Helen was 5, she had invented about 50 signs, some for people, some for things. A pull meant come, a shove meant go. When she wanted bread, she acted out the cutting of slices and buttering them. Pinching a tiny bit of skin on her hand meant small. Spreading her fingers wide and bringing her hands together meant large. If it was ice cream she wanted, she shivered and made the motion of turning the handle of the ice cream freezer. She had a different sign for every member of the household. Glasses for her father, a stroking motion against the cheek for her mother. She knew when company came because she felt the opening and shutting of the front door. When they left, she waved her hand for goodbye from a vague memory of what the gesture meant. She learned what keys were for and one day locked her mother in the pantry when everyone else was out of earshot. Kate spent 3 hours pounding furiously on the pantry door, while Helen sat outside on the front steps enjoying the vibrations of the pounding. She was strong, active, reckless, and she was beginning to understand that other people talked with their lips. When she moved her own lips the same way, nothing happened. Sometimes this made her so angry that she kicked and screamed until she was exhausted. It seemed to her that herself, her normal childhood self, was taken over at times by another self, a powerful being that she called Phantom. When she wrote about it many years later, helplessly the family witnessed the baffled intelligence as Phantom's hands stretched out to feel the shapes which she could reach but which meant nothing to her. She struck out at this unknowable world, hitting, kicking, blazing up in outbursts of anger that grew more and more frequent. Nobody knew how to calm the wild, destructive little animal she had become. She broke lamps, shattered dishes, stuck her fingers into everybody's plates when they were having their meals, and ate what she liked, roaming from plate to plate. In the opinion of her Uncle Fred, Helen no longer belonged with the family. He told his sister, "You really ought to put that child away, Kate. She is mentally defective, and it is not very pleasant to see her about." Aunt Ev had a different opinion. According to Aunt Ev, Helen had more sense than all the Kellers. It was only a question of finding some way to reach her mind. Then Helen learned she was no longer her mother's only darling. There was a new baby, her sister Mildred. Held and rocked in her mother's arms, this newcomer occupied the place that used to be Helen's alone. One day she rushed at the baby's cradle, overturned it, and toppled the baby out. Kate caught her just in time. How did you reach a mind that was locked in silent darkness? Helen was growing bigger and stronger day by day, and wilier, too. She got whatever she wanted by manipulating her elders. What would her future be? The thought of a 20-year-old Helen roaming through Ivy Green, uttering those choked screams to express anger, sightless and speechless and shut out from all human companionship, must have been terrifying to Kate. Helen was taken to another doctor. Although he could do nothing for her, he offered the first ray of hope. They must consult Alexander Graham Bell in Washington, D.C. He said, the same Dr. Bell who was world famous for inventing the telephone. Dr. Bell would know about teachers of deaf or blind children. So they went to Washington, the captain, Aunt Ev, and Helen, leaving Kate at home with the baby. In preparation for the trip, Kate had curled her daughter's hair with a curling iron and brushed out the bangs that framed her face. It was a wonderfully pretty face, with delicate features and an unusual expression, a questioning look under her raised eyebrows. When she came before Dr. Bell, he lifted her onto his lap and gave her his watch to play with. He was a big man, heavily bearded. Later in life, Helen remembered the watch and the beard and the sense she had of being surrounded by love when she sat on his lap. What Belle remembered was that in her well-shaped face, for all its intimations of dormant intelligence, there seemed to be an indefinable, chilling emptiness. Although he was known for inventing the telephone, Dr. Bell's lifelong interest had always been the education of the deaf. His mother had been deaf, and so was his beautiful wife. Now he instructed the captain to write to the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston and tell the director the Kellers needed a teacher for a deaf-blind child. It was at the Perkins School 40 years earlier, Dr. Bell explained, that another deafblind child had been taught to read and write and to speak with hand gestures. She was still alive, still at Perkins. What was done for her could surely be done for the captain's daughter. The Kellers went home to Tuscumbia, and a letter was sent to Michael Anagnos, the director of the Perkins Institution. After 1955, it was known as the Perkins School. When he answered, he said he had someone in mind. He had been discussing it with her. Could the captain tell them how much he proposed to pay? The teacher, Anagnos, had in mind was a recent graduate of Perkins, not blind, although she had been partially blind for many years. Her name was Anne Sullivan. Annie to everyone who knew her. She was 20 years old. As Annie remembered it, when Mr. Anagnos asked if she thought she could teach this little girl, she was very sure she couldn't. She wasn't trained for it. She wasn't, in fact, trained for anything. One moment she told herself she was too good for work of that kind. It would amount to burying herself in a small southern town when she longed for excitement and novelty, when she was far too young to be buried alive. The next moment she reminded herself that she needed a job, any job. She was absolutely alone in the world. Her education had been brief and sketchy. Her childhood was squalid. She had no choice then. She would have to go to Tuscumbia. Chapter 2. Tewksbury. In Massachusetts, the state poorhouse at Tewksbury was a huddle of shabby buildings, housing about 1,000 inmates, on each of whom the state spent $1.88 a week. In 1876, Annie Sullivan, aged 10, and her 5-year-old brother Jimmy had been placed in a farmer's cart and delivered to the Tewksbury poorhouse because their relatives couldn't think of anything better to do with them. To begin with, their parents had been penniless, Irish immigrants, illiterate and unskilled. Now their mother was dead. Their father, a shiftless drunk with an explosive temper, was hardly able to care for himself, and nobody wanted Annie, who was half blind from trachoma, or Jimmy, who had a tubercular hip and walked with a crutch. Neither of them had ever been to school. When they arrived in Tewksbury, the children learned they would have to be separated. Boys and men lived in one place, girls and women in another. Annie howled when she heard it, so loudly and desperately that they were allowed to stay together in the women's ward of the hospital. That first night they slept in a single bed in what Annie remembered as a small, dark enclosure, perhaps 10 feet long at the end of the ward. It was the place where corpses were wheeled to await burial. People called it the dead house. From then on they were assigned to a bed apiece, side by side in the women's ward. One morning Jimmy developed a high fever. That night, while Annie slept, he died very quietly, so quietly that Annie never heard them roll his bed away. But when she awoke and found him gone, she knew what had happened, and ran screaming into the dead house to clutch the bars of his iron bed, screaming until she had screamed the whole place awake. People tried to pull her off, but she kicked and scratched and bit, so they dropped her on the floor and left her there. She remembered wanting to die. Meanwhile, the world outside was growing suspicious of Tewksbury. Infants who were born there died within months, people said. The place was so short of money they couldn't afford to separate the sane from the insane, or those with contagious diseases from everyone else, and rats were said to be everywhere. The children were even said to have played with the rats. A committee was formed to investigate the poorhouse. Annie heard it would be headed by Mr. Frank Sanborn, chairman of the State Board of Charities. He was the powerful one, the one who could get her out of Tewksbury and into a school where she would learn to read. When they came, Annie followed them as they moved through the building, wondering which was Mr. Sanborn. Every face looked blurry to her, but even if she could see them clearly, how could she tell who he was? And they were ready to leave. She threw herself into their midst, crying, "Mr. Sanborn, Mr. Sanborn, I want to go to school." Someone asked what was wrong with her, and she mumbled, "I can't see very well." They asked how long she had been in the poorhouse, and she said she didn't know. The committee left Annie, learned a little later that she was going to school after all, leaving Tewksbury to be educated at the Perkins Institution in South Boston. It was October 1880, and she was 14 years old, a good-looking, dark-haired girl, sturdily built. She had her father's temper. She had occasional black moods when the world seemed hateful to her, but she was also quick-witted, thoroughly down-to-earth and tough. She would need those qualities at Perkins. The school was a famous one, largely because of the man who founded it, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, and his pupil, Laura Bridgman, the deaf-blind child he had taught to read, write, and speak with her fingers. Educators all over the world knew the story, and Boston was immensely proud of it. The children who came to Perkins belonged to the best middle-class families. They were bright and well-mannered, and for the most part adjusted to their blindness. They were still children, however, and quick to take advantage of anyone they felt to be inferior. On her first day at Perkins, Annie was brought to a singing class where the teacher, who was blind, asked for her name. Annie Sullivan. Spell it, the teacher said. But of course she couldn't, and the class of teenage girls burst out laughing. "How old are you?" asked the teacher. She said she was 14. 14 and can't spell? Horribly humiliated, Annie had to listen to more laughter. Even the teacher laughed. She had to learn the alphabet using the raised type Dr. Howe favored. Then she learned spelling, reading, simple arithmetic, everything her classmates had known since they were 6 years old. A great gawk of a girl, starting from the beginning and mocked by everyone. Homesick for Tewksbury and lonelier than she had ever been, she cried herself to sleep every night. But she refused to let it show. She pretended she didn't care, pretended to be scornful and contemptuous of the others. "When is your brain awake?" one teacher demanded. "When I leave your class," Annie shot back. Michael Anagnos took notice of her and arranged for her to have 2 eye operations a year apart that gave her almost normal vision. She taught herself to read ordinary print and began to enjoy some of her classes. Yet she was still a rebel, claiming to despise all middle-class people, which meant everyone who was not Irish Catholic and wretchedly poor. One day Laura Bridgman came to the cottage where Annie lived. She was a thin, plain-looking woman of 50 who sewed and made beautiful lace, but had never learned to cope with the world outside. She continued to live at Perkins, spending a year in one of the residential cottages, then moving on to the next. When Laura lived in Annie's cottage, Annie learned the manual alphabet, words spelled out letter by letter into the listener's palm, in order to converse with her. Graduation drew near. Out of 4 boys and 4 girls, it was Annie Sullivan who emerged as the top student, the one who delivered the commencement address. The others went home afterwards, but Annie's only home was the Tewksbury poorhouse, where she wasn't wanted for the summer because part-time residents were discouraged. Fortunately for Annie, she was invited by her house mother, Sophia Hopkins, to spend the summer at Cape Cod. Captain Keller's first letter was forwarded to her there, and Annie wrote to Anagnos, asking if she might come back to Perkins and go over the records Dr. Howe had kept when he was Laura Bridgman's teacher. Anagnos encouraged her to do so, even though the job was not yet definitely offered. Annie returned and studied Dr. Howe's methods, which were entirely his own invention, at once straightforward and easy to understand. There was another letter from the captain, this time with a firm offer: room, board, laundry, and a salary of $25 a month. She would be treated like a member of the family. $25 every month, with all her other expenses paid, it seemed most generous to Annie. She told the captain she accepted and promised herself she would spend all her earnings on clothes, extravagant and beautiful clothes, that would be hers alone, not charity clothes or hand-me-downs. 2 months later she set out by train for Tuscumbia, a journey of several days and nights. Because she was still unsure she had made the right decision, she cried a good deal, which irritated her right eye. Pain and anxiety kept her from sleeping. When she did sleep, she was pursued by nightmares. Chapter 3. Teacher Arrives. It was a late afternoon in March 1887, 3 months before Helen's 7th birthday, and the Kellers were expecting Annie Sullivan. For 2 days one or another of them had gone with Kate to the station, meeting every train because they didn't know which one Annie would be on. Helen, too, was waiting. Standing on the sunny porch, she felt the repeated opening and shutting of doors and the vibration of many footsteps. She knew the family were tense and excited, and she wanted to find out why. That evening Annie Sullivan, her eyes inflamed, her body quivering with anxiety, arrived on the 6:30 train. She rode back in the carriage with Kate and her stepson James. They went into the garden where the captain welcomed her. Then they moved to the porch. Now Annie saw the child from close up, and saw that she was robust and strong, dirty perhaps, troublesome, but certainly not spiritless, for the face was intelligent and eager. What Helen remembered were approaching footsteps, her own outstretched hand and somebody taking it. She thought at first it was her mother, embracing her and wanting to kiss her, and when she found it was a stranger she struggled frantically to break free. She explored the unknown face, the dress, the bag, which she grabbed and tried to open. It was hard to do. She felt carefully, searching for a keyhole, and when she found it she faced the stranger, made the sign for turning a key, and pointed to the bag, because there was surely something good to eat in it. Visitors usually brought her treats, and she wanted them now, immediately. Kate took the bag away. At this the child's face grew red to the roots of her hair, as Annie wrote later to Mrs. Hopkins, and she clutched at her mother's dress while kicking violently. Annie brought out her little watch and managed to hold it against Helen's face. Once the child felt the ticking, the tempest subsided. Next morning Helen was taken to Annie's room and allowed to help unpack her trunk, where she found a doll the little girls at Perkins had sent. The doll's clothes were specially made by Laura Bridgman. Annie decided this was the moment to teach Helen her first word. I spelled DOLL slowly in her hand and pointed to the doll, and nodded my head, which seems to be her sign for possession. Annie wrote to Mrs. Hopkins. Whenever anybody gives her anything, she points to it, then to herself, and nods her head. I took the doll, meaning to give it back to her when she had made the letters, but she thought I meant to take it from her, and in an instant she was in a temper, and tried to seize the doll. I shook my head and tried to form the letters with her fingers, but she got more and more angry. I forced her into a chair and held her there until I was nearly exhausted. It occurred to Annie then that it was useless to continue the struggle, and she let the child go, but without giving her the doll. Running downstairs, she got some cake, brought it to Helen, and spelled CAKE into Helen's hand, while holding the cake out to her. Of course she wanted it and tried to take it, but I spelled the word again and patted her hand. She made the letters rapidly, and I gave her the cake, which she ate in a great hurry. Then I showed her the doll and spelled the word again. She made the letters DOL and L, and I made the other L and gave her the doll. Then Helen fled downstairs and refused to have anything to do with Annie for the rest of that day. The greatest problem I shall have to solve is how to discipline and control her without breaking her spirit, Annie wrote to Mrs. Hopkins. The spelling lesson continued, alternating with lessons in the stringing of kindergarten beads and the sewing of sewing cards, all brought from Perkins. Helen did them well and with pleasure, and there were no more displays of temper for a while. But a few days later Annie had a battle royal with Helen, and this time it was a Helen she had not met before. This time she saw the Helen who belonged to Phantom, her tyrant self. The family was in the dining room eating breakfast, and Helen stuck her hand into one plate after another to grab whatever she liked. Then she stuck her hand into Annie's plate. The hand was removed and set firmly aside. Bewildered, Helen tried again and again. Her hand was removed and set aside. Several times, many times. There was mounting fear and anger on Helen's part. The family suffered for her, longing to see her eat, no matter how, but Annie would not allow it. Then one by one the family quietly tiptoed out of the dining room. Annie gave her a spoon. Phantom hurled it to the floor. Annie pried her out of her chair and compelled her to pick up the spoon, compelled her to take up food with it, then forced the food into her mouth. When this breakfast was finished, the two of them spent an hour locked in battle over the folding of Phantom's napkin, after which Annie opened the door, letting Helen out into the warm sunshine, then went up to her room to cry her heart out. There would be more battles, often dangerous ones for Annie. Because of the bottled-up rage within her, the child possessed exceptional strength, and yet she wasn't aware of it in the sense of knowing cause and effect. She had no way of connecting the kicks and blows she aimed at this unknown someone with the someone who was hurt by them. Phantom knew nothing about other people's feelings or about other people. Phantom was a stranger to love, to reason, to everything but instinct. Once Helen refused to sit down at a table to learn any more of this finger business, and emphasized her refusal by kicking over the table. Annie set the table back in place and insisted they go on with the Lesson. Then Helen's fist flew like lightning and knocked out one of Annie's front teeth. Phantom again. Phantom making her presence felt. Helen's parents were of course aware of Helen's tyranny when she was under the spell of Phantom. They too had suffered from it, had been black and blue at times from her flat refusal to do anything except what she wanted to do. Yet they always rushed to protect their poor afflicted child. Annie knew it was not protection she needed, not even love, not yet. She needed to be taken away from the family, out of their sight and hearing, beyond the reach of their protection. It was a great deal to ask of the Kellers, but Annie did ask, and eventually they agreed. Soon Helen found herself in a place that was strange to her, where she felt lost, abandoned. She remembered one particular morning when she and the stranger began some kind of scuffling, going around and around an object that was probably a bed. The stranger showed her by firm movements that she must either lie down on the bed or else get up and dress. She refused to do either. She behaved like a wild horse. Helen said later because she was caged in this unknown place with an unknown person larger and stronger than she was. But it was only the garden cottage, with all the furniture changed, the door kept locked and their meals sent in to them. If Helen had known she was a stone's throw from Ivy Green, she would have fled to her parents, but she couldn't, no. They had taken her there by a roundabout route, without warning or explanation. Another thing she had no way of knowing was that her father stopped by every morning to look through the window. Once he saw Helen still in her nightgown sitting on the floor, her breakfast untouched on the table. It seemed to him she was the picture of despair. With tear-filled eyes he went to Cousin Leila and told her, "I have a great mind to send that Yankee girl back to Boston. It is 10 o'clock, and poor little Helen has not been allowed to have breakfast." Aunt Ev, who happened to be present, told him, "No, Arthur, you must not feel that way. Miss Annie is going to be Helen's salvation." In the garden cottage Helen refused to let Annie near her. She went repeatedly to the door, as if expecting someone, and from time to time she touched her cheek, which was her sign for her mother, then shook her head sadly. The lessons continued, as Annie told Mrs. Hopkins. "She has learned 3 new words, and when I give her the objects the names of which she has learned, she spells them unhesitatingly. She was calmer, too, or else resigned. The little savage has learned her first lesson in obedience," Annie wrote. Then word came that the captain wanted them home. This was a disappointment to Annie, who had hoped the family would allow a longer stay. But they didn't, or perhaps couldn't. A few weeks after they left Ivy Green for the cottage, the teacher and pupil were back home with the others. Annie established a routine. They spent early mornings outdoors, then came in for sewing, bead stringing, and crocheting, all of which Helen enjoyed, although Annie considered them a waste of time. They went outdoors again for gymnastics, which was followed by an hour devoted to the learning of new words. By the end of the month Helen knew 18 nouns and 3 verbs. But Phantom was not yet defeated. According to Helen, Phantom began to improve, but she still lacked the normal child's love of praise. She was not aware that she had been punished because she did not distinguish between right and wrong. She had no words for right and wrong. Although she was willing by now to repeat whatever finger plays Annie put into the palm of her hand, she had no words. Like a clever dog, she had simply learned some tricks. One morning, the morning when everything changed, they had a struggle over the words mug and water. Annie tried to impress on Helen that M-U-G was mug and nothing else, and that W-A-T-E-R was water and nothing else, but Helen kept confusing the two. Annie gave it up for the time being. Later, when Helen was playing with her new doll, Annie put an old rag doll into her lap and spelled D-O-L-L, trying to show that the same word applied to both. Helen had had enough of this spelling. Seizing the new doll, she dashed it to the floor and felt a thrill of triumph when she felt the fragments at her feet. They went outside into the warm sunshine that Helen loved, then down the path to the well house, where someone was drawing water. Annie put Helen's hand under the spout. Cool water gushed over that hand, as Annie spelled into the other hand the word W-A-T-E-R, first slowly, then rapidly. Helen was startled for a moment. Then she stood very still, her whole being fixed on the 2 hands. Something stirred inside her. It seemed to her later that somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. Everything had a name. The name and the thing were closely connected. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness, as of something remembered, a thrill of returning thought. Flinging herself to the ground, she asked Annie for the name of what she was lying on. She pointed to the pump and wanted its name, then the trellis. When she asked for the stranger's name, the stranger told her, "Teacher." On the way back to the house, Helen touched everything she could reach, and felt its name spelled letter by letter into her hand. As soon as a thing had a name, it began trembling with life. When she fell asleep that night, she could hardly wait for morning. It was April now. A month had passed since Annie came to the Kellers, and the captain paid her her first month's salary. She wrote immediately to Michael and Agnes, saying she was ready to pay back what he had lent her for train fare. He refused to take it, urging her to start a savings account first and repay him later. In the meanwhile, I need scarcely say that I am deeply interested in your little pupil. She certainly is a remarkable child. I have no doubt that ere long she will be able to talk. Able to talk! Not only to talk with her fingers, but to do so ere long. Annie had already seen a clipping from the Boston Herald newspaper, an article that said Helen was talking fluently. Michael and Agnes was surely responsible for it. Why, one might just as well say that a 2-year-old child converses fluently when he says, "Apple, give," or "Baby, walk, go." Annie told Mrs. Hopkins. She disliked this theatrical exaggeration, and for her pupil's sake was afraid of it. But there was nothing Annie could do to stop public fascination with Helen. Chapter 4. Finger Talk. Helen had a little cousin, aged 15 months. Whenever they went to visit her, Annie watched and listened. She saw that the baby understood a great deal. People told her, "Come, kiss, go to papa, or shut the door," and she did as she was told. But while she understood the words, she never tried to say them. Annie came to an interesting conclusion. The child had been born with the ability to learn language, and she couldn't help learning it any more than a bird could help learning to fly. It was as if language had been built into her brain. She heard people talk, and at the right age she began to understand them. At another right age she would imitate their talk. Annie decided to use the same system with Helen. She would talk into Helen's hand the way people talked into the baby's ears, using complete sentences from the start, filling out the meaning with gestures, and all along she would do everything in her power to interest and stimulate Helen's mind. It was a method she thought up by herself. It had nothing to do with Dr. Howe or Laura Bridgman or anything found in books, but was solely the creation of 20-year-old Annie Sullivan. One day Annie walked into the room laughing. She put Helen's hand on her face while spelling "laugh" into the other hand, then tickled Helen into a burst of laughter. Helen had not laughed since she lost her hearing. Now she was gently persuaded into laughter. Annie took her through the motions of swinging, tumbling, jumping, hopping, skipping, each time suiting the spelled word to the act, and whenever she gave Helen a new word, Helen threw her arms around her teacher and hugged her. By the end of April, Helen knew more than 100 words. A month later, almost 300. By June, 400, including mattress, bedstead, sheet, dust, and maple sugar. And all this time Annie used no schedule, no schoolroom, no planned lessons. Helen was learning the way the baby learned, by being surrounded with spoken words. They set up a little store, filled it with provisions, and sold them for real coins that Helen touched and learned to tell apart. They went fishing with hooks and lines, and Helen caught a very small fish, which was cooked for her supper. She held frogs in her hand to feel the throbbing throat. She dug barehanded in the garden, because Annie believed it was every child's natural-born right to dig in dirt, and whatever Helen was doing, her teacher described it for her in finger talk while she was doing it. During those months of spring, while Helen learned the names of things, another sort of learning took place. It had to do with the feelings that bound teacher to pupil. Helen had refused at first to let Annie kiss her. In those days she didn't want to be kissed by anyone but her mother. This changed after the day at the well house, when teacher threw open the door of the prison cell. From then on, Helen kissed and embraced her teacher, and learned to love her with a whole heart. They were together all day long, and in the evenings, while Helen slept, Annie sat in their bedroom holding one of Helen's dolls and singing to it. She had played with dolls all her life. Now at the age of 20 she had a real child to care for, one who was bright and strong and beautiful. I feel in my heart that I belong to Helen, and it awes me when I think of it. This giving of one's life that another may live, she told Mrs. Hopkins. God help me to make the gift worth while. The word lessons continued. Once when Helen was stringing the kindergarten beads, arranging different sizes in groups of 2 large, 3 small, and so forth, she made several mistakes that Annie pointed out. Then Helen discovered an error by herself. Something was obviously wrong in the sequence of beads, but she couldn't tell what it was. Annie touched the child's forehead, at the same time spelling into her hand the word think. When Helen saw that this word was the name of the process going on in her head, it was her first understanding of an abstract idea. She was learning adjectives and adverbs, and they came to her as easily as nouns. She was also discovering what the ordinary conversation of ordinary people was like, a difficult business for the deaf, to say nothing of the deaf-blind. Whenever they were with the family, Annie repeated to Helen everything that was said, and not just the bare bones, but the whole of it, complete with idioms, all translated into quick movements in the palm of the hand. The manual language is less mysterious than it seems. Kate had learned it within weeks of Annie's arrival, and the captain learned the rudiments. Helen was 7 years old now, the age when most children are taught to read and write, and even though she had learned to speak less than 3 months earlier, in Annie's opinion she was as ready for books as any sighted child. This is how Helen remembered it. As soon as I could spell a few words, my teacher gave me slips of cardboard on which were printed words in raised letters. I had a frame in which I could arrange the words in little sentences, but before I ever put sentences in the frame, I used to place them on objects. I found the slips of paper which represented, for example, doll, is, on, bed, and placed each name on its object. Then I put my doll on the bed with the word is on bed arranged beside the doll, thus making a sentence of the words with the things themselves. One day she pinned the word girl on her dress. On a shelf she arranged the words is in wardrobe. Then she stood inside the wardrobe, waiting excitedly for her teacher to come and continue the game. The two of them played it for hours on end, sometimes with everything in the room arranged in sentences. A bystander might have had trouble deciding which one enjoyed it more. They went on to the business of writing, usually a wooden writing board that had grooves on it, a traditional tool for teaching writing to the blind. A paper was fitted over the board, then Helen formed the letters in the grooves, guiding her pencil with the forefinger of her left hand. This stiff-looking, angular script was known as square hand. Annie put one of the writing boards between folds of paper on the table and guided her pupil's fingers to form the sentence. Cat does drink milk. Helen was delighted. She was writing. She could say whatever she liked in this square hand script. Soon she would be able to write letters, which was something grown-ups did. She could take the letters to the post office herself and mail them herself. Very soon after that she began learning Braille, the system of writing for the blind that uses characters made of raised dots. It was invented in 1824 by Louis Braille, a Frenchman who had been blind since early childhood. At the same time Helen was making good progress in arithmetic, and then without warning she slipped backward into the embrace of Phantom, her savage self. The child of one of the servants, a girl named Viney, found Helen putting little stones into a glass tumbler and thought she might break the glass. When Viney reached for the glass, Helen resisted. Viney tried to force it from her. Helen shrieked, kicking, biting, and scratching at Viney, still shrieking and sobbing between shrieks. She began to shake all over. Annie ran downstairs and grasped Helen's hand. She tapped into it, wanting to know what had happened. Helen spelled Viney bad and renewed her attack on Viney. Annie held both her hands in a firm grip until at last she calmed down. Later that day Helen went to Annie and tried to kiss her, but Annie said, I cannot kiss, naughty girl. Helen is good, Viney is bad. You struck Viney and kicked her. I cannot kiss, naughty girl. Helen stood very still for a moment, struggling with Phantom. Then she tapped into Annie's hand. Helen does not love teacher. Helen do love mother. Mother will whip Viney. At dinner Helen found that Annie wasn't eating. Her not eating was hurtful. Why wasn't she eating? Annie said she couldn't eat because her heart was sad, and Helen began to cry and sob and cling to her. Yes, she would go with Annie, while Annie told Viney that Helen was sorry. She would let Viney kiss her, but she wouldn't kiss Viney in return. Although the incident ended well, it left Annie somewhat shaken. She told Mrs. Hopkins, "I had hoped this would never happen again." Helen had been so gentle and obedient the past 2 months that Annie thought love had subdued the lion, but it seemed he was only sleeping. Annie, of course, had her own temper to deal with, her own sleeping lion. Now that the captain could say a few words to Helen, he tended to forget he wasn't supposed to interfere with Annie's methods. From time to time he taught Helen one word or another, or sent for her in the middle of a lesson. This was galling to Annie, who resented any challenge to her authority over Helen's education. She was also finding it hard to fit herself into a town so narrow and backward it seemed to belong to another century. Tuscumbia's population of 3,000 consisted of blacks and whites in equal numbers, the blacks illiterate, living in ugly poverty and treated, in Annie's opinion, like household pets. Indulged when they behaved, punished with pitiless severity when they failed to. At times it was amazing to her that she was employed by a family of former slave owners. She missed Boston and big city life and never learned to love the South, but she made her peace with it for Helen's sake, not only because she loved Helen, but because of another of her insights. In a long letter to Mrs. Hopkins she wrote, "Something within me tells me that I shall succeed beyond my dreams. I know that Helen has remarkable powers, and I believe that I shall be able to develop and mold them. I cannot tell how I know these things. I had no idea a short time ago how to go to work. I was feeling about it in the dark, but somehow I know now, and I know that I know." Anagnes asked Annie to write a paper about Helen for the school's annual report. While she worked on it, Helen sat beside her composing a letter for the little girls at Perkins. "Papa does shoot ducks with gun, and ducks fall in water. Helen does ride on horseback with teacher. Helen does give Hardy, her horse, grass in hand. Teacher does whip Hardy to go fast. Helen is tired. Helen will put letter in envelope for blind girls." Anagnes was charmed by the letter, and for Annie's composition he had only enraptured praise. Both were printed in their entirety in the annual report, complete with a picture of Annie and Helen and several of Helen's letters. The report was gobbled up by newspapers in the Boston area, who magnified it. Then it was picked up by other newspapers, and they magnified it yet again. Before long it had snowballed into a story of such outsized proportions that some people, especially in Europe, perceived it as one more American claim to own whatever was biggest and best. Furthermore, there were teachers of the deaf-blind who suspected that Miss Sullivan of lying. How could anyone know what the child actually said when everything had to be translated from the manual language by her teacher? Yet there were many who believed in the miracle, including Alexander Graham Bell, an expert on the education of the deaf. Between the doubters and the believers, Helen was well on her way to becoming one of the most famous children in the world. As Christmas approached, Annie and Helen prepared for it by reading books about Christmas, making up their own Christmas stories, and in general exploring the possibilities of Christmas. For it was Helen's first. Before she had never understood what was going on around her during the holiday season, and never took part in it. Now, with Annie's help, she prepared surprises for everyone, and hugged the secrets to herself, thrilled by the game of hints and half-spelled sentences. "The mystery that surrounded the gifts was my greatest delight and amusement," she recalled. Everyone in the family was deeply moved by the difference between this bright Christmas and all the others when the child was held prisoner by Phantom, locked in the world that was a no world, as Helen described it later. Once Kate said, with tears in her eyes, "Miss Annie, I thank God every day of my life for sending you to us, but I never realized until this morning what a blessing you have been to us." Captain Keller took her hand and could not speak, but to Annie his silence was more eloquent than words. Her own heart was full of gratitude and solemn joy. The new year started. Helen would be 8 that year and would embark upon her first great adventure, a visit to Boston. The year would also bring the beginning of the end of Helen's life with her family. She would always love them. She would come back to them repeatedly, but she would never again belong to them the way Mildred did, or her brother Phillips Brooks, who was born a few years later. Chapter 5. Boston. Instead of going directly to the Perkins Institution, Annie and Helen stopped first in Washington, D.C., where they had been invited to meet President Grover Cleveland. As Helen described the visit, "He lives in a very large and beautiful white house. and there are lovely flowers and many trees. Mr. Cleveland was very glad to see me. Then they set out for Boston in the school, arriving on May 26, 1888. Helen met the blind children. She played with them, talked finger talk with them, kissed them, did beadwork and knitting with them, explored their embossed maps and the typewriter especially designed for the blind. Then Annie took her to visit Laura Bridgman. They found her sitting by a window in her room, crocheting lace. When Annie put her hand on Laura's hand, there was instant recognition. And then, as Helen recalled, she kissed me kindly, but when I tried to examine the lace, she instinctively put it out of my reach, spelling rather emphatically, "I'm afraid your hands are not clean." Helen wanted to touch Laura's face, but she shrank away like a mimosa blossom from my peering fingers. Laura was extremely dainty in all her ways and exquisitely neat. My strong, impulsive movements disturbed her greatly. Helen started to sit on the floor, but Laura pulled her up, spelling, "You must not sit on the floor when you have on a clean dress." When they were ready to leave, Helen tried to kiss Laura goodbye and in the process stepped on her toes, which made Laura so thoroughly annoyed that Helen felt like the bad little girl of the Sunday school books. There were people at Perkins who found Helen too much of a tomboy, too eager to put herself forward. Such a contrast with gentle, ladylike Laura, they said. They held Annie Sullivan to blame, and to some degree they were right, since she was the one who taught Helen to laugh out loud, to climb trees and dig barehanded in the dirt. Annie must have been very much aware of the contrast between the two when she first brought Helen to Laura Bridgman, sitting in the quiet room where she made her lace. The next event in their Boston visit was the Perkins commencement, a grand occasion that always drew overflow crowds. The governor of Massachusetts sat on the platform face to face with the cream of Boston society and representatives of the great colleges for which the city was famous. The Perkins students sang, their brass band performed, 10 little boys were examined in mental arithmetic, and then Helen appeared. Standing with Annie at a table, her face glowing with anticipation, she sensed the audience, their movements, their perfumes and odors, and the scraping of their chairs. When the moment came for her to perform, her whole body seemed to tremble. With the fingers of her left hand she read a poem about birds, spelling it into Annie's palm with the other hand. Annie recited the words aloud. The audience was enthralled. After the ceremony, many of the guests stayed behind to watch Helen, some waiting to speak to her with Annie's help. There was something about the child that attracted others. She was so radiantly alive, so eager to embrace people when she met them, old or young, male or female, although Annie suspected a preference for men and boys. In a letter to her mother a few months later, Helen described a reunion with the children of some family friends. "Clifton did not kiss me because he does not like to kiss little girls. He is shy. I am very glad that Frank and Clarence and Robbie and Eddie and Charles and George were not very shy." When Perkins closed for the summer, Helen and Annie went home with Mrs. Hopkins to Cape Cod. For Helen, who had read about the ocean but had never been near it, this was her first opportunity to touch the mighty sea and feel it roar. No sooner was she helped into her bathing suit than she sprang out into the sand and plunged into the water. I felt the great billows rock and sink. The buoyant motion of the water filled me with an exquisite, quivering joy, she remembered. Suddenly my ecstasy gave place to terror, for my foot struck against a rock, and the next instant there was a rush of water over my head. She stuck out her hand, searching for support. She grabbed at seaweed, at water, adrift and terrified, gasping for breath. She was hurled back on shore without warning, and in an instant folded in her teacher's arms. As soon as she recovered from her first panic, she demanded, "Who put salt in water?" The wonder of it was that only a few days later her courage returned, and she was back in the water once more, being thrown around by waves. Then they were home again in Tuscumbia, taking long walks to a place called Keller's Landing. It was an old lumber wharf on the Tennessee River where Helen learned geography by making miniature islands and lakes, digging riverbeds, and building dams of pebbles. Annie told her about the great round world with its burning mountains, buried cities, moving rivers of ice. They studied longitude and latitude, using strings with sticks for the poles. They turned Helen's room into a wigwam, a castle, a fort, a Greek marketplace. They fought the American Revolution and acted out myths and everything. Helen learned seemed more like playing than learning. But Annie was no happier in Tuscumbia than she used to be. It was a horrid little town, she said. People snubbed her. She felt caged in exile. Helen, too, missed Boston. She told her father to earn a great deal of money and buy a big house there, but she was not miserable in exile or caged, and she spent much of her time writing to the many friends she had made in the East. Annie, bristling, but most of those letters are written to strangers and not to your friends. They are my friends because they think of me and write to me, Helen said. Annie did not intend to remain in exile for long. She told the Kellers that Helen deserved to be at Perkins. The child had such an appetite for learning she needed to know everything, to understand everything. At Perkins there was systematic and specialized teaching, a large library for the blind, and at their doorstep one of the nation's finest, most historic cities. Reluctantly, the Kellers agreed, and arrangements were made for Helen and Annie to come to Perkins as guests of the school. They arrived in October, and Helen plunged in directly. Geography, botany, zoology, arithmetic. At dinner she went up to one of the teachers, Fanny Merritt, and said, "Will you teach me French?" Miss Merritt would and did, and was amazed by Helen's memory. When beginning the second lesson, Miss Merritt was ready to review the words from the first lesson, but Helen said in an emphatic, surprised way, "I know them. Please teach me something new." Not only was she hungry for information, she insisted on digesting and mastering it. Once, when puzzled by some problem in her homework, she told Annie about it. Annie suggested the two of them go for a walk, and then perhaps understanding would come. But Helen refused to run away from her difficulties. "I must stay and conquer them now," she said. She was passionately fond of poetry. After reading some works by John Greenleaf Whittier, she wrote to thank him for his beautiful poems. "I love you very dearly," she told him. She was taken to visit Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great New England writer, and sent him a letter afterwards. Holmes published it in a column he contributed to Atlantic Monthly magazine. She composed little stories. She wrote a letter to St. Nicholas, the periodical for children, and it was printed there. In the spring of 1890, Mary Swift Lamson, who had been one of Laura Bridgman's teachers, returned to the school after visiting Norway. She told Annie and Helen about a Norwegian girl, Ragnhild Kata, who was deaf and blind and who had been taught to speak aloud. Mrs. Lamson had scarcely finished before Helen was on fire with eagerness. She resolved that she too would learn to speak. Annie discouraged it. She said the voices of deaf children sounded unpleasant to her, but Helen gave her no peace, for the possibility of speech had been on her mind a long time. In their first days at Perkins, she had asked her teacher, "How do the blind girls know what to say with their mouths? Why do you not teach me to talk like them? Do deaf children ever learn to speak?" Annie had explained at the time that some deaf children did learn to speak, but they had the advantage of being able to see their teachers' mouths, and this guided them. Helen never gave up the dream. As soon as she heard about the Norwegian girl, there was no restraining her, and she must and would be taught to speak. Annie surrendered. They went together to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston, whose principal was Sarah Fuller, a woman greatly admired by Dr. Bell. Miss Fuller offered to teach the child herself, beginning then and there. Taking one of Helen's hands, she placed it on the lower part of her own face. Helen's other hand was put inside Miss Fuller's mouth, where she could feel how the tongue and lips were positioned. Then Miss Fuller made the sound of I as in it. By the end of that first lesson, there would be 11 altogether. Helen had learned to pronounce the letters I, M, P, A, S, T. In her mind's eye she saw herself returning to Tuscumbia and embracing the family one by one while saying each of their names aloud, and then she would touch their faces to feel the expressions of joyful surprise. Her little sister would understand her now, Helen thought. I used to repeat ecstatically, "I am not dumb now." In the times between lessons she practiced constantly. One of Helen's Alabama cousins remembered Annie's role in those practice sessions. Her mouth would be open, wide enough so that Helen could put her fingers all the way in, sometimes far down into the throat. Annie might be nauseated, yet unless she managed at the same time to make the sound, Helen was learning to copy. The point of the lesson would be lost. While she practiced, Helen was learning something else, a byproduct of the speech lessons that would prove to be equally valuable. She was taught to read the speech of others with her fingers. By placing her middle finger on the nose, her forefinger on the lips, and her thumb on the throat of that other person, she could follow what was said. This lip reading was probably the least publicized of Helen's accomplishments, but one of the most remarkable. She discovered later that her speech was imperfect and sadly limited, but she spoke in a living voice, and it was something she had wanted for herself, not what Annie wanted, what Helen wanted. It gave her a feeling of independence, something else she longed for. She was 11 years old now, halfway to being 12 and not far from the start of adolescence, and in many ways remarkably like other girls that age. She was also unlike them in many ways. She lived in a beautiful world inhabited only by kind-hearted people who trusted and loved one another, and in this beautiful world everyone loved her. Helen's belief in universal loving kindness was about to be tested. Chapter 6. The Frost King. In 1891 Helen wrote a little story, The Frost King, as a birthday present for Mr. and Agnes. The family read it and talked about it, as Annie recalled, and agreed it was a marvelous creation, so imaginative, so flooded with color. Yet it was hard to understand how Helen came to describe these colors without being able to see them. "Where did you read this lovely story?" they asked her. Helen told them, "I did not read it. It is my story for Mr. and Agnes's birthday." Then she carried it to the post office and mailed it. The story was overly sweet and sentimental, although very much in keeping with some children's literature of the time. It had to do with a collection of precious stones belonging to the Frost King, who sent them to Santa Claus, after which they were magically used to paint the leaves of oak and maple trees. And Agnes, who found it captivating, sent it to the Mentor, a publication of the Perkins Alumni Association, where it appeared in January 1892. One morning toward the end of that month, Helen waited for Annie to come upstairs and comb out her hair. When Annie came she brought a thunderbolt. "Someone wrote to Mr. and Agnes," Helen told her diary, "that the story which I sent him as a birthday gift, and which I wrote myself, was not my story at all, but that a lady had written it a long time ago." And its appearance in the Perkins publication, the story had been picked up by the Goodson Gazette, whose editors recalled something very similar that was written years earlier, a story called The Frost Fairies, by Margaret Canby. Long sections of Helen's stories were then published in the Gazette, side by side with sections from Mrs. Canby's work, and in places they were not only similar, but identical, paragraph for paragraph, word for word. Helen went to bed that night confused and miserable. She had never heard Mrs. Canby's story, she said. "I do not know what I shall do. I never thought that people could make such mistakes. Mr. and Agnes is much troubled. It grieves me to think that I have been the cause of his unhappiness." The editors of the Gazette wanted it known that they did not blame little Helen Keller for the attempt at fraud. Far from it. The blame for the fraud rests not upon her, but upon whoever knowingly attempted to palm off the Frost King as her composition, and there the blame will be. They meant Miss Sullivan. At Perkins and elsewhere in Boston a good many people were eager to see Annie Sullivan as the villain in this drama. Mr. and Agnes was not one of them. He was genuinely proud of Annie, and he loved Helen. But everywhere he turned he seemed to hear the word plagiarism, as if the whole of Boston had seen those parallel columns. He had the school's reputation to think of as well as his own, and he panicked. He directed that every book in the library be searched for a copy of the Canby story. Every teacher must be examined to see if she remembered reading it to Helen, discussing it with Helen. Anxious inquiries were sent to the Kellers, but no trace of the story could be found. Nobody had even heard of it. And Agnes should have thrown up his hands at this point, should have said that this was a mysterious business, one that might never be explained, but that it was also unimportant. Helen had sent him a birthday greeting, one that was never meant for publication. Why did it matter where this birthday greeting came from? Instead, he had Helen and Annie brought before an examining committee, all teachers or officers of the school, 4 of them blind, 4 sighted. Then Annie was instructed to go, leaving Helen at the mercy of the court. She was questioned and cross-questioned by judges who seemed determined to make her admit that the Frost Fairies had been read to her. Doubt and suspicion colored their every word. "The blood pressed about my thumping heart, and I could scarcely speak," Helen said later. "Even the consciousness that it was only a dreadful mistake did not lessen my suffering." At the end of the inquisition the committee was evenly divided, 4 for conviction, 4 for acquittal, but then Agnes cast his vote in favor of Helen, and there the verdict rested, acquittal by a hair's breadth. When Helen went to bed that night, I imagined I should die before morning, and the thought comforted me. I think if this sorrow had come to me when I was older, it would have broken my spirit beyond repairing. Nobody held Helen responsible. However, it was always Annie they blamed, Annie who had warped an innocent mind. Annie maintained that Mrs. Hopkins had read the story to Helen in the summer of 1888, a very long time ago, it was true, but then Helen had an extraordinary memory. Annie denied up and down that she herself had ever heard of the frost fairies, much less read it to Helen, and this was all she had to say on the subject. What really happened? The only conceivable explanation is that Annie did indeed read the story to Helen. She might have seen no harm in Helen's using parts of it in her own version. She might also have been ignorant of laws against plagiarism, if such a term can be used about a personal letter, and by the time Annie came to understand that it meant the stealing of someone else's words or ideas, she lacked the courage to back down. Mrs. Canby wrote to Helen and Annie. Her letters were wise, generous, and affectionate. Samuel Clemens, writing as Mark Twain, had this to say 10 years later when he came to know Helen. Oh, dear me, how unspeakably funny and owlishly idiotic and grotesque was that plagiarism farce, as if there were much of anything in any human utterance, oral or written, except plagiarism. As for Agnes, to Helen and Annie both he tried to remain the loving friends he had always been. In time his attitude would change, but that was later, for now it seemed that Perkins had been dealt a near mortal blow and survived. Everything, everybody, went on more or less as before. At the end of May, Annie and Helen traveled south to Ivy Green in a summer of misery. They found the captain so heavily in debt that he borrowed $35 from Annie. Everything the Kellers owned was mortgaged. Meanwhile, Helen was pale, listless, preoccupied with her own anxieties. There were hours when she sat quite still, not speaking, taking no interest in anything, not even her books. Something was wrong with her world. It used to be full of people who loved her. President Cleveland, the great inventor, Dr. Bell, the teachers at Perkins, all of them had loved her once, and she had loved everyone in the world, but the world had changed. She could no longer be sure of being loved. Maybe she could no longer be sure of anything. Sleepless, tormented by the heat of a southern summer, she was ill off and on for weeks at a time. Suppose she never got better. Once she tapped into Annie's hand her fears that she might die in this uncertain new world. The affair of the Frost King left such a bitter aftertaste that when Helen wrote about it years later, she said, "Joy deserted my heart, and for a long time I lived in doubt, anxiety, and fear. The thought of those dreadful days chills my heart." But then the weather changed, the air turned crisp, invigorating, and Helen showed signs of improvement. She had been asked to write a sketch of her life for a youth's companion, and started work on it, although the thought that what I wrote might not be absolutely my own tormented me, as she recalled. Sometimes in the midst of a paragraph I was writing, I said to myself, suppose it should be found that all this was written by someone long ago. I wrote timidly, fearfully, but resolutely. Bit by bit the pieces were assembled into a whole and read to Annie, who was very much moved by them, and in mid-December Helen mailed off a completed manuscript. The editor was so delighted that he sent Helen a check for $100. This was followed in January by a New York's present of $50 from that same editor who published the article in January 1894. A philanthropist in Philadelphia sent money. John Spaulding, another rich benefactor, gave Helen 15 shares of stock from a trust he had founded. Yet she was frequently sick during the holidays, and the generosity of her friends was further spoiled by her father's interference. He took charge of the stock, the money gifts, even the check for her article, which he had hoped to use to start a lending library in Tuscumbia. Now the money for such a project was out of her hands. There was no talk of their going back to Perkins, although Agnes continued to urge it, at least to Helen. He wrote to her as tenderly as before. He missed her sorely, was interested in everything she did, but he rarely wrote to Annie. The winter wore on, a restless one, without direction and without much in the way of education. They had a lesson now and then, but nothing seemed to lead anywhere, and nothing mattered very much. Then unexpectedly a reprieve came, one that promised excitement and a change of scene. Captain Keller decided to go to Washington in March, bringing Helen, Annie, and Mildred. They would be present at the second inauguration of President Cleveland. They would go to Boston, and afterward to Chicago for the World's Fair of 1893. Helen was beside herself with joy. And Annie Annie began to hope that Anagnos would meet them in Washington, that they would be friends again. He never came to Washington. When Helen and Annie arrived in Boston, they saw that the friendship with Anagnos was over. It was after 1893, Helen wrote some years later, after we had ceased to avail ourselves of the hospitality of the Perkins Institution, that Mr. Anagnos proved untrue to the friendship between us. It was then that he declared and continued to declare to one person and another his opinion that we were one or both guilty. Once at the kindergarten for the blind, in the presence of several friends, one of whom reported the matter direct to us, he said, "Helen Keller is a living lie." By this he meant, as he explained to the friend, that Annie had taught Helen to deceive. That was the wrong Mr. Anagnos did, my teacher. Helen's letter continues, that was the untruth he told of me. It was a sad end to the sad story of the Frost King, and it was not the last time Annie's temperament, her high-handedness, her inability to admit a mistake would disrupt lives and friendships. They turned increasingly to Helen's first friend, Alexander Graham Bell. He became the guide and protector Anagnos used to be, but a far wiser and more experienced one. Helen had loved him from the first moment they met, and he loved her in return, both for herself and for a quality in her that touched him to the depths. "I feel that in this child I have seen more of the divine," he once said, "than has been manifest in any one I ever met before." He had two daughters, Elsie and Daisy, who were about the same age as Helen. They, too, became her friends and admirers. But there were times when all three were in their teens that the daughters felt twinges of jealousy because of their father's devotion to Helen. After Boston, and what Helen remembered as a thrilling detour to Niagara Falls, they went on to Chicago, where they were joined by Dr. Bell. In Jackson Park, facing Lake Michigan, the fairgrounds sprawled over 686 acres and cost $28 million. More than 20 million visitors came to see it. Helen Keller, an eager, animated 13-year-old, attracted attention wherever she went. A photo taken at the time shows her in profile, her head covered with short curls, her neck long and graceful, everything about her almost painfully lovely. She had been given official permission to touch even the most delicate things, so I took in the glories of the fair with my fingers, she wrote. It was a sort of tangible kaleidoscope. Everything fascinated me. One evening they went to the Midway, where Helen found the bazaars of India and the lagoons of Venice. She boarded a Viking ship, rode on a new ride called a Ferris wheel, named after its inventor, and also on a camel, and explored the streets of Cairo. Her letter to John Spaulding describing the fair was later published in the magazine St. Nicholas. Dr. Bell began encouraging her to think about a career as a writer. They spent 3 memorable weeks at the fair, but then the reprieve was over, and the real, earnest workaday world awaited them. Since the part of Helen's life belonging to Perkins was finished, like it or not, a new chapter would have to begin. Where would it take them? Helen's most earnest desire was to continue her education in a school for normal girls. She discussed it with Dr. Bell, and he immediately agreed, for he had always believed that the deaf must not inhabit a separate world. Annie, who had the same belief, mulled over the possibilities. No public school could be expected to teach a deaf-blind student, and private schooling had to be paid for. In her opinion, the captain's financial affairs were not going to improve. He had failed to pay her salary for months, and as it happened was never able to do so again. This meant he would be unable to pay for the education that Dr. Bell and Annie wanted for Helen, and Helen wanted for herself. Then a pathway opened. Annie heard about 2 young men, Dr. Thomas Humison and John Wright, who planned to start a secondary school in New York where deaf youngsters would be taught to speak. Wright and Humison believed their methods would improve Helen's voice, that she might even be taught to sing, and John Spaulding was eager to pay for it. Now all the questions about Helen's future education, which school would take her, and where it would lead, found an answer in New York. The Wright-Humison School, as Helen wrote to a friend, was quite fashionable. She would study arithmetic, English, literature, American history, French and German, as well as lip reading and speech, a broad and interesting high school curriculum. In the autumn of 1894, Helen and Annie settled into a new life at the new school in a pleasant house close to Central Park. A New York Times reporter came there one evening to interview Helen, who was accompanied by Topsy, her cat. A discussion followed about how she came to choose the cat's name. The most remarkable part of this conversation was that it was carried on entirely by word of mouth, the reporter said. Helen answered every question in the ordinary way, and she listened by placing her fingers on the speaker's face. The speaker being Dr. Humison, who spoke slowly and distinctly. She used 3 typewriters with great neatness and accuracy. The interview continued. One was for her journal writing. She was most conscientious about writing a certain amount every day, and if original ideas give out, the young girl proceeds to pad most conscientiously. The reporter found her altogether amazing. Having read other interviews of Helen Keller full of exalted sentiments and beautiful language, he had formed a picture of a remote and highly spiritual young person, entirely out of tune with the everyday world. But the girl he saw before him was clever and quick. She smiled and laughed and showed a great enjoyment of life under conditions which would seem to many persons unbearable. Helen went with her class to see the Statue of Liberty, climbing the staircase to stand in the head that overlooked the comings and goings of ships in the harbor. Another time the class went to the dog show at Madison Square Garden. One day Helen and Nanny set off on an expedition of their own to the slums of the Lower East Side, where new immigrants lived. The streets were crowded with people whose clothing smelled of machine oil and sawdust and salted fish and poverty. Inside the tenement dwellings were windowless rooms teeming with rats and cockroaches, and that same sour smell of poverty. It was an experience Helen never forgot. Her speech was slow to improve. I wonder why it is so difficult and perplexing for a deaf child to learn to speak, when it is so easy for other people, she wrote to a Boston friend. But she was learning, all the same.